Chapter 5. Repositing uMakhulu as an institution of knowledge, beyond biologism towards uMakhulu as the body of indigenous knowledge, by Babalwa Magoqwana. Introduction. Central to the sociology of pre-colonial African society was the elderly woman's leadership in the economy and the household. This role was later eroded by colonization, religion, and today increasingly promoted by neo-traditionalism, concealed as African culture, which resembles the colonial patriarchal structures as in erasing African women's contribution in African societies. It is the invisible and unacknowledged histories of these women that have reduced them to an ugly face of poverty and underdevelopment in the world today. Elderly African women's role in the economy, markets, and in sustaining the rural communities has been reduced to a shadow of what it used to be, and today sounds mythical to the younger generation as they see everyday violence against women as the norm, entrenched in the social fabric of our communities. To address this misperception, we need to historicize uMakhulu, grandmother or elder mother in isiXhosa, by reclaiming and recognizing the elderly woman or the elderly African woman's bodies as institutions of indigenous knowledge, dissemination and storage in the pre-colonial and contemporary society. The term uMamamkhulu, elder mother shortened to uMamkhulu, is used to assert isiXhosa as a source of knowledge. Using this term avoids the inherent epistemological challenges provided by grandmother in reinserting the notion of extended family as the norm. The notion of uMakhulu can also refer to uMomkhulu, senior mother, who is not directly a mother's or father's mother, but a mother's elder sister. As Ntuli has argued, language represents a specific worldview and ontology, which is why the isiXhosa term uMakhulu rather than grandmother is maintained throughout this chapter. The use of the term attempts to contribute to local concepts rather than adopting imposed categories, theories, and paradigms that tend to be unfit for local conditions. This chapter seeks to challenge some of the narrow conceptions that define uMakhulu purely in economic and seniority terms in African households. I argue that we need to position uMakhulu as an institution of knowledge that transfers not only history through Ntsomi folktales, but also as a body of indigenous knowledge that stores, transfers, and disseminates knowledge and values. In seeking to go beyond the narrative of uMakhulu as a safety net or caregiver under harsh socio-economic conditions in the rural households, I make use of Oyeronke Oyewumi's understanding in The Invention of Woman of the biologic to argue for uMakhulu as a productive but invisible institution. It is this institution that shapes our spiritual awareness in the African household, building on Kondiwe Kondlo's notion of isazela, conscience, as part of desired public leadership values. In repositioning uMakhulu as the institution of knowledge, I argue we are then provided with an analytical framework that enables us to move beyond the gendered binary nature of institutions of learning, public versus private spheres of learning. In this new interdisciplinary framework, beyond the frontiers of binaries, we are then able to integrate local languages and values carried over by our grandmothers in dealing with social, political, and economic challenges in our societies. This process of epistemic redress will commence a healing process for our communities from the destructive impact of centuries of colonial thought systems and their impact on our social organization in our African households. In my argument, I seek to answer a call by Ifi Amadueme in Male Daughters and Female Husbands, Gender and Sex in an African Society, in her preface when she challenges African feminists to center Africa's matriarchal heritage in understanding women's relationship to power in post-colonial society. In repositioning uMakhulu as a body of indigenous knowledge, I contend we are then able to dig deeper in our own logical languages and rehistoricize our sociological concepts in African societies to produce all-rounded African scholars with firm ontological security. In using uMakhulu as the body of indigenous knowledge systems, I assert that, as suggested earlier, that we need to go beyond the binary biologist understanding of uMakhulu to include the historical foundations she builds in the African households through socialization of children, oral history, through Intsomi, folktales, and Amabali stories, and spiritual labor to induce Isazela conscience. It is through modernizing these techniques of uMakhulu into digital spaces that we can also archive the shared and transferred knowledge systems beyond the rural areas. In recentering uMakhulu as part of Nguni women's histories, I argue that we can begin to challenge also the patriarchal bias that has shaped the understanding of women in Xhosa history through isihlegu sika Nongqawuse, the catastrophe of Nongqawuse, to explain landlessness and the suffering of the AmaXhosa in the 19th and 20th century. This patriarchal bias in the history of the Eastern Cape has been constructed without taking into consideration the rich matriarchal histories of pre-colonial Africa and how women used to influence armies, religious institutions, national economies, and political leadership. Tisani shows that in the Cape, Xhosa chiefs were in constant communication and advised by the elderly women who sometimes acted as regents in the absence of the older chiefs. The exclusion of women from the writings belied what was happening at the time. During the 1830s, 4 senior houses in the Xhosa polity, as listed as the genealogies table in the Christian Watchman, had queen mothers taking charge of affairs while their heirs were minors. With the sudden death of Hinsa in 1835, Nomsa had to step in and support her son, who was still Ikroala, a young man who just returned from initiation school. When Ngqika died in November of 1829, Sutu became Sutu became regent during the minority of the Rabe Sandile. Again with pronunciation. This rich matriarchal contribution becomes very clear with the Zulu monarchy in the 18th and 19th centuries. Shamase details the power and strong character of Mkabayi Kajama and her twin sister Mama, who heeded the military harems, Izikotlo, and became a regent when Senza Gokona died in 1781. This history and influence of women among Nguni populations is not unique, as Stidi details the history and meanings of African women leadership in West Africa. I make use of the Nguni languages and idioms to create, later in my argument, the link between values, knowledge, and spirituality carried by this body of uMakhulu. As the pillar of many African households, uMakhulu teaches many of us about the resilience, or what Motseme calls survival wisdom, in the harsh socio-economic conditions experienced by black households in African societies. I hope to show uMakhulu as the embodiment of indigenous knowledge rather than the invisible, unproductive body she is currently perceived to be in our societies. uMakhulu and the bodies that matter. On October 1st, 2017, the United Nations celebrated the International Day of Older Persons with the theme Stepping into the Future, Tapping the Talents, Contributions, and Participation of Older Persons in Society. This theme speaks to the centrality of the elderly in our societies as foundations of knowledge towards ensuring sustainable development. Despite their rich survival wisdom, older persons are often neglected and invisibilized in our societies as unproductive bodies. Being uMakhulu is a life stage that most women cannot escape, as it forms part of the adult life of a woman as soon as they reach menopause. every isiXhosa African woman, like many other women in Africa since pre-colonial times, inherently knows the knowledge responsibilities embodied by this life stage without question. There is no formal training in entering the life stage as institution, but age, knowledge, and experience prepare women for it. It is the inevitable nature of this role and position that uMakhulu occupies, which makes her a significant part of the socialization process for most African households. However, later in my argument, I move beyond this biology-centered definition of uMakhulu towards the spiritual nature of ugogo, the grandmother in isiZulu, to problematize age and spirituality. The limits of confining power of uMakhulu on aged, unproductive bodies becomes very clear when we discuss the spiritual nature of this institution of knowledge as part of the ontological spiritual foundation of amatswasa. The fixation with young and productive bodies, or what Oyoronke Oyowumi in the Invention of Woman terms biologism, is in understanding our social issues has resulted, in my view, to many ignoring the role and significance of uMakhulu as an institution of knowledge. Oyowumi's concept of biologic is used to understand how uMakhulu has been positioned as an unproductive body within the capitalist logic. This concept is a critique of the Western logic in centering biology as the center of difference and hierarchy in society. The notion of society that emerges from this conception is that society is constituted by bodies as bodies: male bodies, female bodies, white bodies, poor bodies, rich bodies, Jewish bodies, Aryan bodies, black bodies. She speaks to the physicality that dominated Western thought, which makes the body to always be in view and on view. This constant gaze tends to define differences in society and forms the center of the epistemological differences between Western thinking and Yoruba society. The latter tends to privilege the senses rather than the view. She traces the separation between body and mind dualism to this conception of the body as a trap to which ideas cannot flow from. The biologic implies that elder African women bodies are inherently unproductive and therefore must contribute to the reproductive labor system, care work, performed by mostly other black women. This emphasis on physicality and hierarchy of bodies has put African women as non-thinkers, but also as bodies, at the bottom of the ladder in knowledge production. This biologic does not recognize that in many African households, the female power ultimately lies in postmenopausal women who are respected and feared because of her seniority and wisdom rather than the shape or desirability of their bodies. Following on Oyewumi's assertion of this epistemological trap, I position uMakhulu as the body of indigenous knowledge from which ideas about history, leadership, and survival do indeed flow. uMakhulu forms the center of what we know and how we know in many African households and directly contributes to the epistemic foundations of knowledge with spirituality as part of knowing in her institution. uMakhulu, the embodiment of the unproductive body. As indicated earlier, because of her age and non-participation in the labor market, uMakhulu tends to be seen as part of the unproductive bodies in our societies based on her biological and labor market incapacity. She tends to be postmenopausal and therefore has biological limitations on bearing children of her own, even though she has many. This biological determinism connects the body with the capitalist production system, which promotes profit and accumulation. Hence, her biological clock defines her as unproductive, as she cannot biologically give birth to more productive bodies. Magubane believes that the characterization of the unproductive and therefore undesirable body is built on Adam Smith's notion of characteristics of the unproductive workers he disapproves of. Based on the biologic of the productive and unproductive bodies, uMakhulu is relegated to the latter, as the capitalist labor system recognizes the young and able-bodied who can contribute to the capital accumulation through selling their labor power. Most of the time, she is desexualized, without sexual desire, and therefore deemed only important when it comes to her ability to socialize the children and support the mothers. This is also noted by Laurel Semley in Mother is Gold, Father is Glass, in her introduction on motherhood in Ketu, a West African Yoruba town. She argues that the older mother or elder mother is a position that is respected and sometimes feared because of the elder mother's secret knowledge, which might sometimes be termed as witchcraft. In Yoruba, to see the older woman's authority only in relation to biological motherhood obscures the important role of occult power that shrouds postmenopausal women in particular, which invokes fear as much as respect. This status of being an elder mother is granted by not only marriage or giving birth to children. It speaks to seniority that one enjoys in the community as an elder. This is why Oyewumi asserts that seniority is socially constructed, not dependent on chronological age or the type of body, but on social relations in the household. The suspicion of witchcraft is therefore linked to the elderly, physical, desexualized body and the powers that seem to be embodied by elderly bodies. Zinn Magubane, in Bringing the Empire Home, has traced the history of language on how the African woman's body was deemed beautiful before the age of 25. This, she argued, was part of the missionary and later social thinking in the Cape Colony and Scotland. The black woman's body was often contrasted with the African male bodies that were deemed small. The African bodies that were deemed small, firm, graceful, and neat, not subject to temporal changes. Magubane quotes Stephen Kay when she described the bodies of the African woman in the Cape in the 1800s. As in most barbarous nations, the lot of the Abafazi woman is hard indeed. When young, they are in many instances beautiful, laying aside the prejudice of color, but the hard labor which they commence as soon as they enter the married state, and which may be regarded as some kind of bondage, soon destroys the charms which nature may have gifted them, and they become, at an early age, even disgustingly ugly. Reading these missionary accounts of beauty and productivity, Magubane then suggests that to be female is to be, literally and figuratively, a physical extension and manifestation of the system of productive relations. It is this inability of the grandmother to sell her labor power that makes her undesirable to the capitalist system. She cannot bear children, future laborers, or perform the actual labor that can directly contribute to the market relations. Instead, she becomes a burden for the state in expecting social welfare and being taken care of by the young. Despite being dubbed as unproductive bodies, elderly African women in the apartheid Bantustan reserves have always performed the reproductive labor, as they provided an economic base for the labor needed during the migrant labor system. Related to this assertion, Koch reminds us that the extended family in the reserve fulfills the social security function necessary for the reproduction of the migrant labor force. This notion of the extended family mainly refers to elder women who looked after the household. This reproductive function of the elderly African woman is not limited to the rural homelands in apartheid South Africa, but continues today under the social welfare system, where grandmothers tend to subsidize the unemployed youth. Siqwana Ndulo also acknowledges the position of the elderly women who were charged with caring for their unmarried daughters and sons' offspring, in addition to relatives of different kids, under the migrant labor system in South Africa. Grandmothers were forced to care, to supplement the cheap labor system that forced the black man into the city for pittance and exploitation. These women in the reserve sustained the African households, caring for the sick, the young, and disabled. uMakhulu, the narrator of history for the young. This institution of knowledge cuts across the pre-colonial to the present society with its influence of understanding the past of African households. In The Destruction of Black Civilization, Williams argues that primary education in pre-colonial chiefless Africa included storytelling, mental arithmetic, community songs and dances, learning the names of various birds and animals, the identification of poisonous snakes, local plants and trees, and how to run and climb swiftly when pursued by dangerous animals. Even during colonial Africa, legends and folk tales were very popular forms of entertainment in those days. Many African leaders give credit to uMakhulu as the major influence in their socialization and understanding of oral history. Ellen Kuzwayo, Emma Mashini, Walter and Albertina Sisulu are among many. In effect, Nkosinathi Biko opens the collection of Biko's writings in I Write What I Like by mentioning uMakhulu as the source of record keeping for the history and life of Steve Biko. Even the well-known Zulu king Shaka ka Zinn Senzang Kona's reign tends to be traced back to his paternal grandmother, Mtania, who died at 95 years of age with two powerful daughters, who later influenced Zulu royal family affairs. Nomatamsangha Tisani confirms this role of uMakhulu as a foundation of historical knowledge, as she transfers knowledge through Intsomi and Amabali. It is these sessions around the fire at the end of each day that provided an opportunity for learning by the youth from the grandmother that served as the foundation for historical knowledge and igniting the imagination of the young. This is why Magona, in To My Children's Children, asks, "How will you know who you are if I do not or cannot tell you the story of your past?" Intsomi, as Magona says, are an integral part of the child's socialization among amaXhosa. These stories taught children about good, bad, duty, obedience, responsibility, honor, and orderliness. She goes on to say that the best storyteller around the fire was the maternal grandmother. Growing up with uMakhulu in the 1990s, I experienced this institution through Intsomi and Amabali. In fact, I still remember stories by my grandmother about pride of who we are, about ancestors, marriage, and so on. I remember GC Mhlope, who was always narrating Intsomi on Umhlobo Wene FM regional isiXhosa radio on Saturday mornings. With my siblings, we used to sit and listen to Ina's narration stories and teachings about animal names, morality, and ways of being. This program continues on this radio station even today under a different host as part of South African Broadcasting Corporation's education program. As illustrated through this radio education program, uMakhulu is indeed a pedagogy in her own right, and similar knowledge-making spaces can inform how children are taught in the classroom today. This acknowledgement means we can start using the institution of Makulu's ways of sharing knowledge as the foundation for young children's curriculum and ways of teaching, thereby building towards a more accessible and complementary primary school curriculum that sees the African household as a part of learning spaces rather than divorced from knowledge. This means that we start acknowledging children's cultural base, languages, and innate intelligence, thus valuing their language and sense of being from an early age. uMakhulu as the performance of spiritual labor. In situating local knowledge in uMakhulu's body, we are not only reasserting the importance of seniority, wisdom, and spirituality, but we are also recentering the invisible embodied experiences that have contributed to how we know what we know. Tisani asserts that uMakhulu is our ontological foundation. She lives in our something. All it says is ME, and I can't see. It's cut off. She goes further to highlight the importance of the maternal grandmother in the process of ukutswasa, the spiritual calling. Tisani notes that one can only tswasa through maternal grandmother's ancestors. This is confirmed by Mkhize in her conversation with Gogo Ngoachakumba a practicing African doctor, when she says, "I am not sure why someone is called Baba, even if they are a woman, but the only thing I can think of is that because our lineages are patrilineal, but spiritually you are from your grandmother, so your father, Obaba, gives you your law, but the gift of calling comes from your grandmother." This process of ukutswasa gives a clear understanding of the spiritual importance of this institution. When uMakhulu provides a historical education through iziduko and ukuzituta, clan names and genealogies respectively, she becomes a fundamental base for which to understand oral histories. It is her historical knowledge and spiritual forms of education that make her an integral part of the ukutswasa, spiritual forms of education that make her ukutswasa process. Hence, she becomes the ontological spiritual foundation when she passes on to the non-living world. Tisane confirms the spiritual nature of this institution by saying, African doctors, amatswasa, have a revelation and are connected with those who have gone before and the present. When one recites the family genealogies, ezituta, they revisit their elders because the elders are archives. They pass knowledge and help create new knowledge. As noted earlier, the pre-colonial African education system was linked to teachings on genealogies, which directly speak to the family histories. This training on genealogies of the family becomes useful in the process of ukutswasa, to be ugogo, a traditional healer. In isiZulu, ugogo is also used to refer to the ancestor of those who have gone through ukutswasa. This female designation to be ugogo transcends gender, and the nature of the body as ugogo can be given to both male and female initiatives of amatswasa, regardless of physiology. To those who are invested in biologism, the concept of ugogo and ubaba could be very confusing, as the body is an ancestral plane which does not conform to gender binaries. Instead, both terms are transferable across all genders depending on the role. One is plain, not so much the gender of the person. In the practice of ukutswasa, the gogo principle helps you in the spiritual aspects, and your father, ubaba, is the one who helps guide you in the physical world. These gender dynamics on the body of ugogo help us imagine a different kind of spirituality that separates the body, gender, and hierarchy of power in our societies. Gogo's body helps us destabilize the biologic that defines hierarchy attached to physical bodies and spirituality. As ugogo can be senior without being physically older in the age sense, this seniority is derived from the ability of amatswasa to access the archive of knowledge through abadala, elders, and help in formulating new knowledge. This means one can be ugogo through the spiritual process of ukutswasa, not by age. Hence, Oyewumi maintains that seniority is not chronological. I think a whole sentence is chopped off. This spiritual and historical position of an elder mother provides a framework for which we can start building a woman-centered vernacular theory. In fact, the former South African public protector, advocate Tusile Madonsela, sought to interpret the cultural, political, and spiritual link of her duties to the South African public as that of the Vavenda female spiritual leader, uMakhadzi. An aunt, who is a non-political figure, serves as a buffer between the ruler and... King's ears, eyes, and conscience. If someone has the complete... Because a lot of sentences are getting badly chopped off. Like, these are terrible, terrible scans. He ignores her at his own peril. Makhadzi, as articulated by Madonsela here, connects the elder mother to a conscience, isazela, of the community, and therefore provides a perfect start in theorizing beyond the secularized episteme. Isazela is not just a learned behavior like the political consciousness derived from the disembodied and secular institutions. Instead, I argue, Isazela is a direct result of the spiritual labor performed by uMakhulu, who provides spiritual and survival wisdom under the harsh socio-economic conditions of the African household. uMakhulu hence provides an inclusive and well-rounded approach of knowing without segmenting and disconnecting it to the everyday life. For instance, her teaching on environmental awareness through recycling in African households is indicative of this institution in seeing the environment, society, and spirituality as a connective unit. Recycling of goods, clothes, tins, saving water has been part of this institution long before we knew about its environmental benefits. This role illustrates uMakhulu as an institution of survival knowledge to the benefit of stabilizing our environment, spirituality, and economy by organizing knowledge in an accessible and restorative manner. This is a form of pedagogy which practically helps us deal with enduring challenges that have shaped our body of knowledge by contributing to imagining new forms of knowing. Repositioning of uMakhulu as an institution of knowledge. To conceptualize uMakhulu as an institution is not only to analyze her position in the African household using a metaphor, but I suggest it is also to provide a new model about where knowledge is situated, how it is communicated, to understand and appreciate the values carried in that knowledge, and to recognize the bodies able to carry that knowledge. Positioning uMakhulu as an institution of knowledge challenges the categories, definitions, and legitimate sources of knowledge which are limited to the certified knowers. Then this emphasizes the place and importance of local knowledge that is not verified through formal education institutions, making it possible to deal with some of the challenges facing public institutions of knowledge today. Firstly, the challenges the deep historical exclusionary cultures that defined the formal institution of knowledge and offers an alternative understanding of the knower, which can, and the sentence is cut off. Conception of Makhulu as an institution of knowledge automatically deals with the unnecessary separation between the informal and formal institution, which is built on the history of separation between public, productive, and private, reproductive spaces. Federici. Thirdly, uMakhulu offers an alternative understanding of leadership, ethics, and consciousness beyond the current generated and sometimes racialized public leadership roles. The Elder Mother provides a critique of the great masculine hierarchical single leader as representing the old forms of leadership style, which does not take into consideration African matriarchal heritage in leadership. This is why Steady and Oyewumi argue for the maternal ideology and matripotency ethos embedded in women's leadership in Africa. uMakhulu possesses the principles beyond reproductive and nurturing roles in households, but reflects the normative values and humanistic ideologies that embrace notions of preservation of past, present, and future generations. Finally, to include uMakhulu as a source of knowledge, we are forced to acknowledge spirituality as a part of knowledge-making between the living and the non-living. Thus, through this acknowledgement, we destabilized the disembodied and binary knowledge system based on secular knowledge. This is why Oyewumi emphasizes, if we are to create relevant scholarship in African knowledge systems, we have no choice but to be cognizant of the metaphysical in the constitution of power and pay attention to the ways in which spirituality undergirds interpretation of the material world. In my argument, this is the conclusion now. In my argument, I have sought to answer a call by Ifi Amadueme in centering Africa's matriarchal heritage in the embodiment of knowledge and its institutions that shape what and how we know. In repositioning uMakhulu as an institution of knowledge, we acknowledge the unnecessary divisions between the public and private sphere, the household and the state, and knowledge and spirituality. In taking the so-called informal institution as part of learning into the curriculum of our universities and schools, we are then forced to acknowledge the inseparability of the household and learning, the embodiment of knowledge, and the inherent ancient African values carried by this boundaryless knowledge stretching back into the pre-colonial era. critically engaging with the biologic of Uyowemi, I have attempted to blah 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 define her existence in relation to knowledge. Oyewumi's notion of senses as an approach to knowledge speaks to a holistic approach that uMakhulu provides in the terms of the integration of mind, body, and spirit. By moving out of the biological understandings of elderly African women as mere recipients of social welfare, as caregivers, we visibilize and acknowledge them as oral sources of historical knowledge and sources of ontological foundations. Through this paradigm shift, we restore the centrality and spirituality of the African household, of spirituality inside the African household and indigenous knowledge production process. Through the modernized versions of Through the modernized versions of oral storytelling, digital storytelling, we might be able to have uMakhulu influencing not only the rural but also the urban black households. Through these digitized versions of this institution, she might also help many generations in developing survival techniques in the increasingly harsh socioeconomic realities on the continent. To conclude, this chapter is explorative in nature, drawing on my own uMakhulu-based knowledge experience, designed to spark interest around the contribution of the Nguni, especially isiXhosa language, and older African women's bodies as institutions of knowledge that can help us improve how we teach and what we teach today.